The contract ends with a lie. The morning Caroline May Latimer discovered the truth about her betrothal, the Texas sun beat down on the parched earth like judgment itself. She stood frozen in the doorway of the small church office, her fingers gripping the worn wooden frame as she listened to the conversation that would shatter everything she'd believed about love and marriage. The Latimer girl's inheritance should transfer smoothly once the vows are spoken, came the smooth voice of Reverend Josiah Whitfield, the man who'd spent 6 months courting her with sweet words and promises of a godly life together. Her late father's land deed requires a married woman's signature naturally. And she suspects nothing. This second voice belonged to Marcus Whitfield, the Reverend's brother and a lawyer known throughout Galveston County for his sharp dealings. Caroline trusts me completely. She's young, motherless, and eager for the security of marriage. The ceremony is set for Sunday next. By Monday, we'll have filed the papers and that prime cattle land will finally be ours. Caroline's knees trembled, but she forced herself to remain silent to hear every word of their scheme. The bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked for Josiah's desk wilted in her trembling hand petals, falling to the dusty floor like tears she refused to shed. "What about after?" Marcus asked. "A wife can be inconvenient." "There are ways to handle an unwanted wife," Josiah replied, his tone so casual it chilled her blood. "Accidents happen on remote ranches. Or perhaps she'll simply prove too delicate for frontier life and require permanent residence in one of those establishments for troubled women. Dr. Morrison owes me several favors." The wildflowers scattered as Caroline turned and walked away, her steps measured and quiet despite the storm raging in her chest. She made it to the boarding house where she'd lived since her father's death 6 months prior, climbed the narrow stairs to her room, and only then allowed herself to sink onto the thin mattress. Her hands shook as she pulled out the marriage contract Josiah had asked her to sign in advance. "For the church records," he'd said with that gentle smile that now seemed like a serpent's grin. She read through the elaborate legal language with new eyes, seeing now what her trust had blinded her to before. Hidden among the flowery promises were clauses that would grant her husband full control over all her earthly possessions, including the 500 acres of prime grazing land her father had left her. Caroline May Latimer had been many things in her 19 years motherless since birth, her father's sole heir a woman alone in a world that saw unmarried females as either burdens or opportunities. But she had never been a fool, and she would not start now. She struck a match from the tin on her nightstand and held the flame to the corner of the contract. The paper caught quickly, curling into black ash that she let fall into the wash basin. As she watched their plans burn, she made a decision that would have scandalized every proper lady in Texas. She would run. By nightfall, Carolyn had sold her mother's silver brush set to Mrs. Henderson at the general store, traded her 2 best dresses to the seamstress for traveling clothes and sturdy boots, and purchased a ticket on the midnight stage heading north. She left her father's pocket watch, the one thing she couldn't bear to sell, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, along with a letter to her only friend Mary Sullivan explaining her disappearance. At the stable where the stage would depart, she met the driver, a weathered man named Ed Turley, who'd been running routes through Indian Territory for 20 years. "Where you headed, miss?" he asked, eyeing her single carpetbag and the determined set of her jaw. "As far north as this ticket will take me," she replied. "That'd be Dodge City, though a young lady traveling alone." "I'm not a young lady," Caroline interrupted, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "I'm a passenger who's paid her fare. That's all you need to know." Ed studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. But I'll say this, whatever you're running from, make sure you're running to something too. The frontier's got a way of swallowing folks who don't know where they're going." As the stage rolled out of town under cover of darkness, Caroline pressed her face to the window for one last look at the place that had been her whole world. Somewhere in that cluster of buildings, Josiah Whitfield was probably preparing his Sunday sermon, confident that his bride would walk down the aisle in her dead mother's wedding dress, innocent and trusting. Let him wait. Let him stand at that altar in his fine black coat and wonder where his little lamb had gone. By the time he thought to check her room, she'd be 3 towns away, her trail growing colder with every mile. The stage rumbled through the night, and Caroline dozed fitfully, jerking awake each time they stopped to change horses. At dawn, they paused at a way station, and she stumbled out to stretch her legs and splash water on her face from the trough. "You all right, miss?" Ed asked, offering her a cup of bitter coffee from the station pot. "Yes," she said, and found that she meant it. For the first time since her father's death, she felt truly awake. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Over the next days, the landscape changed from the familiar green of East Texas to the sparse beauty of the plains. She'd never been this far from home, never seen horizons that stretched so wide they seemed to swallow the sky. At night, when they stopped at way stations, she heard talk of places with names like Ash Hollow, Cheyenne, and the Black Hills. The men spoke of cattle drives and gold strikes, of Indian troubles and railroad camps, of towns that sprouted overnight and disappeared just as quickly. It was at one such station that Caroline made her quiet vow, speaking the words to herself as she watched the stars wheel overhead in the vast prairie sky. "My first night belongs to no one but myself. No man will take what I don't freely give. No contract will bind what my heart doesn't choose. I am my own woman now, and that is how I'll remain." The other passengers on the stage were a motley collection, a traveling salesman with cases full of patent medicines, a weathered woman heading to Denver to open a boarding house, 2 cowboys returning from a cattle drive, and a silent man in a dark suit who kept his own counsel. Caroline spoke little, deflecting their curious questions with polite but firm responses. When the salesman grew too familiar, suggesting she might need protection on such a dangerous journey, one of the cowboys intervened. "The lady's made it clear she wants to be left alone, Henderson. I suggest you respect that." Caroline nodded her thanks to the cowboy, a young man barely older than herself, with kind eyes and calloused hands. But she didn't encourage further conversation. She'd learned her lesson about trusting too easily. By the time they reached Dodge City, Caroline had less than $10 to her name and no clear plan beyond getting farther away. The town was rougher than anything she'd known: saloons and gambling halls, the stench of cattle pens, men who looked at her with hungry eyes. She spent one night in a cheap boarding house, barricading the door with a chair and sleeping with her father's knife beneath her pillow. The next morning, she found work helping in a laundry for a week, earning just enough to buy passage on a freight wagon heading to Wyoming territory. The driver, a taciturn German named Klaus, asked no questions about why a young woman wanted to travel to such a remote place. He simply pointed to the wagon bed and told her to be ready at dawn. As they rolled out of Dodge City, Caroline didn't look back. Texas was a lifetime ago now, along with the girl who'd believed a reverend's smooth promises. That girl had died the moment she'd heard the truth in the church office. What emerged was someone harder, warier, but also freer than Caroline May Latimer had ever imagined she could be. The journey to Wyoming took 2 weeks of bone-jarring travel through country that grew wilder with each passing day. They followed the old Santa Fe Trail part of the way, then cut north through landscapes that seemed torn from the very beginning of the world. Red rock canyons, endless grasslands, mountains that rose like blue ghosts on the horizon. When Klaus finally rolled into Ash Hollow, Wyoming, Caroline climbed down from the wagon on shaking legs, her dress dusty beyond salvation, her hands rough from helping with the horses, her heart as empty and full of possibility as the wide sky above. "This is as far as I go," Klaus said, handing down her carpet bag. "Town's rough but fair if you keep your wits. There's a seamstress died last winter, shop might still be for rent." Caroline stood in the middle of the dirt main street studying her new home. Ash Hollow wasn't much a collection of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been dropped randomly on the prairie. But it had what she needed: distance from Texas anonymity and the chance to build something with her own hands. She hefted her bag and walked toward the building Klaus had pointed out, her chin high despite her trail-worn appearance. Behind her, she left everything: the marriage that would have been a trap, the inheritance that had made her a target, the life that others had planned for her. Ahead lay only what she chose to make of it, and for now, that was enough. Arrival at Ash Hollow. The morning Caroline first saw the seamstress shop, it stood empty and forlorn, its windows clouded with dust and neglect. A faded sign reading, Mrs. Eliza Hartwell Fine Tailoring, creaked on rusty hinges above the door. The building was narrow, squeezed between Olson's general store and a boarded-up assayer's office, but it had good bones, solid timber construction, and a second story that promised living quarters above the shop. She pressed her face to the grimy window, cupping her hands around her eyes to peer inside. Even through the dirt, she could make out the shapes of a cutting table shelves along one wall and what looked like a sewing machine covered with a dust cloth. Her heart quickened. This could work. This could be hers. "You thinking of taking the Hartwell place?" Caroline spun around to find a stocky woman watching her from the doorway of the general store. The woman wore a stained apron over a practical brown dress, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, though, were not unkind as they took in Caroline's travel-worn appearance. "I might be," Caroline replied, straightening her shoulders. "Who would I speak to about the rent?" "That'd be me, Martha Olson." The woman wiped her hands on her apron and stepped closer, her gaze shrewd. "You a seamstress, then?" "I am." It wasn't entirely a lie. She'd learned to sew from the Mexican women who worked her father's ranch, and she'd made most of her own clothes since she was 12. How different could it be sewing for others? "Where are you from?" "Back east," Caroline said, keeping her answer vague. "I heard there might be opportunity out here for someone with my skills." Martha snorted. "Opportunity. That's one word for it. Another would be back-breaking work for women too stubborn to find themselves a husband." She studied Caroline more closely. "How old are you, girl?" "Old enough to know my own mind and pay my rent on time." Martha seemed to consider this. "Rent's $15 a month paid in advance. That includes the shop and the 2 rooms upstairs. Outhouse is shared with my store, it's out back. Water you'll need to haul from the well at the end of the street. No men allowed upstairs after dark, and I don't tolerate any carrying on. This is a respectable street." Caroline reached into her carpetbag and carefully counted out $15, most of what she had left. "I'll take it." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly, but she pocketed the money. "You got a name?" "Caroline May." She deliberately left off her surname. Latimer was too distinctive, too easy to trace if anyone came looking. "Well, Caroline May, I'll get you the key. Fair warning, Eliza left sudden-like when her consumption got bad. Went to live with her daughter in California. Place hasn't been touched since. You'll have your work cut out for you." That was an understatement. When Martha unlocked the door and Caroline stepped inside, the smell of must and mouse droppings nearly drove her back out. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that managed to pierce the dirty windows. The cutting table was warped from a leak in the roof, now patched but still visible as a dark stain on the ceiling. The shelves held a few bolts of fabric moth-eaten and faded. But the sewing machine, when she lifted the cover, was a beautiful singer in working condition. And the stairs at the back of the shop led to 2 small rooms, a bedroom barely big enough for a narrow bed and washstand, and a slightly larger room with a cook stove, a table, and 2 chairs. "I'll take it," Caroline said again, more firmly this time. Martha handed over the key. "I'll send my boy Samuel over with a bucket and some lye soap. You'll be needing them. And Caroline May." She paused at the door. "Folks here are going to talk. Young woman alone, no ring on her finger, pretty enough to cause trouble. You'd best decide quick what story you're telling and stick to it." After Martha left, Carolyn stood alone in her new domain. Dust particles swirled around her, and somewhere in the walls, mice scurried. But it was hers. No one could take it from her without her say-so. No one could enter without her permission. For the first time in her life, she had a door she could lock and a key that belonged only to her. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By evening, she'd swept out the worst of the dirt, washed the windows, and discovered a treasure trove in a trunk tucked behind the counter. Eliza's patterns carefully folded and labeled. Dresses, shirts, trousers, even a few fancy ball gowns with detailed notes on construction. Caroline spread them out on the newly cleaned cutting table, running her fingers over the familiar shapes. She could do this. She would do this. That night, she made a pallet on the floor of the shop, too exhausted to tackle the rooms upstairs. She bolted the door, checked it twice, and laid her father's knife within reach. Outside, Ash Hollow showed its rougher side. Piano music and raucous laughter drifted from the saloon 3 blocks down. Horses clattered past their riders whooping. A woman's shrill laughter was cut short by a man's harsh words. Caroline pulled her blanket tighter and stared at the ceiling. What had she done? She was 1,000 miles from anything familiar in a town that made Dodge City look civilized with barely enough money for next month's rent. The weight of her isolation pressed down on her chest. But then she remembered Josiah's voice. There are ways to handle an unwanted wife. She thought of the marriage bed she'd so narrowly escaped the legal chains that would have bound her to a man who saw her as nothing more than a signature on a deed. Here she might be alone, but she was free. Her virtue was her own to keep or give as she chose. Her first night and every night after belonged to no one but herself. The next morning brought curious faces to her newly cleaned windows. Women peered in, pretending to just be passing by. Men tipped their hats, some with respect, others with a different kind of interest that made her keep the door locked while she worked. Her first customer came on the 3rd day, Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, the mayor's wife, a formidable woman who sailed into the shop like a battleship into harbor. "I heard we had a new seamstress," she announced, eyeing Caroline up and down. "I need to know if you're any good before I trust you with decent fabric." Caroline met her gaze steadily. "I'd be happy to show you my work, Mrs. Morrison. Perhaps you have something that needs mending. You can judge my skills before committing to anything larger." The woman's stern expression cracked slightly. "Practical. I like that." She rummaged in her bag and produced a silk shawl with a long tear. "This was my mother's. Can you fix it so the repair doesn't show?" Caroline examined the delicate fabric, already planning the tiny invisible stitches she'd use. "I can. It'll be ready tomorrow." When Mrs. Morrison returned the next day, she turned the shawl over and over, searching for the repair. "Where?" "Here," Caroline showed her, running a finger along the nearly invisible mend. "The key is to follow the grain of the fabric and use thread that matches exactly." Mrs. Morrison smiled, a genuine smile this time. "My dear, you've just earned yourself a customer. I have a dress that needs taking in, and my daughter Helen needs a new riding habit. Can you do that?" Word spread. Soon Caroline had more work than she could handle. She mended and altered, took measurements, and made notes. The women of Ash Hollow, starved for anything resembling fashion, began bringing her pictures torn from old magazines, asking if she could recreate the styles with the limited fabrics available at Olson's store. But with the business came the gossip. She heard the whispers when women thought she couldn't hear. Where'd she come from? No wedding ring and won't say anything about her people. Pretty thing like that, working instead of finding a husband. Something's not right. Maybe she's running from something or someone. Caroline kept her expression pleasant and her responses vague. Yes, she was from back east. No, she had no family. Yes, she planned to stay in Ash Hollow. No, she wasn't looking for a husband. That last answer caused the most talk. Unmarried women in Ash Hollow fell into 2 categories, those actively hunting for husbands among the cowboys and miners, or those who worked at the Gilded Lily Saloon trading their company for coin. Caroline fit neither mold, and that made people uncomfortable. 3 weeks after her arrival, she experienced her first real test. Jake Sullivan, a ranch hand from one of the big spreads, swaggered into her shop reeking of whiskey and entitlement. "Heard you were pretty," he slurred, leaning on her cutting table. They weren't lying. "The shop is closed, Mr. Sullivan." Caroline kept her voice level, her hand moving casually toward the scissors on the table. "Ain't here for sewing, sweetheart. Figured you might be lonely all by yourself up there at night. I could keep you company." "I'm not lonely. Please leave." He laughed, reaching across the table. "Come on now, don't be like that. A woman on her own needs protecting. I could—" The shop door opened, the bell jangling sharply. Jake jerked back as Martha Olson entered, her expression thunderous. "Jake Sullivan, you get out of here before I tell your boss you've been harassing respectable women. Mr. Patterson won't take kindly to hearing his hands are acting like animals in town." Jake glared but slunk out, muttering under his breath. Martha watched him go, then turned to Caroline. "You all right?" Caroline nodded, though her hands shook slightly. "Thank you." Won't be the last time something like that happens. You need to be careful, girl. Maybe think about keeping a gun handy, not just scissors. That night, Caroline lay awake, thinking. She'd run from one kind of trap only to find herself surrounded by others. But there was a difference. Here, she could fight back. Here, she could say no and mean it. The next morning, she used some of her precious earnings to buy a small revolver from the gunsmith. She didn't know how to use it yet, but she'd learn. Just as she'd learned to sew to run a business to stand on her own feet. As she worked that day hemming a dress for the banker's daughter, she found herself humming the first time she'd done so since leaving Texas. Outside her window, Ash Hollow went about its rough business. Cowboys drove cattle down Main Street. Miners haggled over supplies. Women hurried past baskets on their arms, children clinging to their skirts. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself back when she'd believed in fairy tales and reverends who spoke of love. But it was her life chosen and claimed by her own will, and that made all the difference. The seamstress shop began to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. She bought a proper bed for upstairs hung curtains she'd made from remnants, even planted a few hardy flowers in a box outside her window. When she walked down the street now, some people nodded in acknowledgement. She was becoming part of Ash Hollow's landscape, as fixed and accepted as the mountains on the horizon. And if sometimes late at night she felt the weight of loneliness pressing against her ribs, she reminded herself that loneliness was just another word for freedom. She'd made her choice, spoken her vow under the prairie stars. Her first night belonged to no one but herself. In a frontier town full of compromises and concessions, that was its own kind of victory. The cowboy who never asked. The first time Silas Boone walked into Caroline's shop, she didn't hear the bell above the door. She was bent over her sewing machine, lost in the rhythm of the needle, when a shadow fell across her work. She looked up to find a man standing quietly just inside the threshold, his hat in his hands. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly coming through her doorway and lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate simple. His clothes marked him as a cowboy, worn leather chaps over faded denims, a shirt that had seen too many washing's boots scarred by stirrup and stone. But it was his manner that made her notice him most. He didn't swagger in like the ranch hands who sometimes tried to catch her attention. He simply stood there, patient, waiting for her to acknowledge him. "May I help you?" Caroline asked, setting aside the dress she was hemming. "Ma'am." He had a deep voice roughened by trail dust and sparse use. "I need this mended before winter sets in proper." He held out a heavy coat torn badly along one sleeve and shoulder. Caroline rose and took the garment, examining the damage. The coat was good quality wool, though aged and weathered. The tear was extensive. It would take considerable work to repair properly. "This is quite a rip," she said, running her fingers along the edges. "What happened?" Most men would have launched into a story about a wild horse or a barroom brawl or some other adventure designed to impress. But Silas Boone just shrugged slightly. "Got caught on some wire. My own fault for not watching where I was going." She looked up at him, then really looked. He had a weathered face, all angles and sun-worn planes, with deep-set gray eyes that met hers briefly before dropping to the hat in his hands. His hair was dark, touched with early silver at the temples, though he couldn't be more than 30. There was something in his manner, a quietness, a deliberate care in how he occupied space that set him apart from the usual rough clientele of Ash Hollow. "I can fix it," she said, returning her attention to the coat. "But it'll take some doing. The fabric's worn thin in places. I'll need to reinforce the whole shoulder, not just patch the tear." "Whatever it needs." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather purse. "What'll it cost?" $3. Half now, half when you collect it." He counted out the coins without haggling another surprise. Most customers tried to bargain her down, especially the men who seemed to think a woman alone could be pressured into accepting less. "When do you need it?" she asked, writing up a receipt. "I'm heading back up to the Bar 7 tomorrow afternoon. If it could be ready by then." The Bar 7. She knew the ranch, one of the larger spreads in the territory, run by old Samuel Patterson. "That's a long ride from here." "Yes, ma'am. But you're the only seamstress in 50 miles who does proper work. Least that's what Mrs. Morrison says. Caroline felt her cheeks warm slightly at the compliment delivered so matter-of-factly. I'll have it ready by noon tomorrow. Appreciate it. He turned to go, then paused. Oh, and ma'am, that's mighty fine work you're doing there. He nodded toward the dress on her machine. The lady who gets that will be pleased. Then he was gone, settling his hat on his head as he stepped into the street. Caroline stood holding his coat, strangely unsettled. In the weeks since she'd opened the shop, she'd grown accustomed to the way men looked at her with speculation, desire, or dismissal. But Silas Boone had looked at her work first, her face second, and with nothing more than polite interest in either. That evening, as she worked on his coat by lamplight, she found herself taking extra care with the stitching. The repair was challenging. The fabric wanted to pucker if she pulled too tight gap, if she left it too loose. She reinforced the weak spots with patches cut from the inside hem, where they wouldn't show her needle moving in tiny, precise stitches that would hold against whatever work he put the coat through. As she sewed, she wondered about him. The Bar 7 was known for hard work and fair wages, but it was isolated high up in the foothills where the wind cut sharp even in summer. What kind of man chose such a life? Most cowboys she'd met were young and boisterous, spending their wages on whiskey and women the moment they hit town. But Silas Boone seemed cut from different cloth. She finished near midnight, holding up the coat to examine her work by lamplight. The repair was nearly invisible, the reinforcement hidden but strong. It would keep him warm through the coming winter. The next morning brought the usual flow of customers, Mrs. Hendricks needing a hem lengthened, young Lucy Patterson wanting ribbon added to her Sunday dress, the minister's wife dropping off a tablecloth with a burn mark that needed clever disguising. Caroline worked steadily but found her attention drifting to the door whenever the bell rang. He came at 11:30, earlier than expected. This time she heard the bell and looked up to find him standing just as he had the day before, hat in hand, waiting for her to finish with Mrs. Garrett's fitting. "I'll just be a moment," Caroline called to him. "No rush, ma'am." He moved to stand by the window, gazing out at the street, giving her and her customer privacy. When Mrs. Garrett finally left, satisfied with the adjustments to her bodice, Caroline retrieved his coat from the back room. "Here you are, Mr. Boone. Silas Boone." He took the coat and examined the repair site, carefully running weathered fingers over the stitching. "This is fine work, Miss Caroline May." She still couldn't bring herself to use a false surname, but neither would she offer her real one. "Well, Miss Caroline, this is better than new. Stronger, I reckon." He pulled out his purse to pay the remainder. "Thank you. I reinforced the whole shoulder area. It should hold up well." He nodded, then did something unexpected. Instead of leaving immediately, he pulled the coat on, testing the movement of the repaired shoulder. As he did, she noticed how thin his shirt was beneath, patched in several places and missing a button. "Mr. Boone," she said impulsively, "that shirt needs attention too. If you'd like—" "It serves well enough." His tone wasn't sharp, just matter-of-fact. "Don't need fancy for ranch work." "I wasn't suggesting fancy, but winter's coming and a missing button lets in cold wind. I could—" She stopped, realizing how forward she sounded. "That is, I repair shirts too." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the feeling he was seeing more than she meant to show. Then he shook his head slightly. "Kind of you to offer, Miss Caroline. Maybe another time." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day to you." After he left, she stood at her window, watching him walk down the street toward the livery stable. His stride was unhurried but purposeful, a man comfortable with solitude and distance. Several people nodded to him as he passed, and he returned the gestures, but didn't stop to chat. "That's an odd one," Martha Olson commented from her doorway. She had a talent for appearing whenever something interesting happened. "Silas Boone. Been working cattle in these parts for 5 years or so, but nobody knows much about him." "Oh." Caroline kept her tone neutral, though she found herself curious. "Keeps to himself up at the Bar 7. Comes to town maybe once a month for supplies. Doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, doesn't visit the Lily." Martha's expression was speculative. "Some say he's running from something. Others think he's just peculiar. Either way, he's never shown interest in any woman in town. Until now." He needed his coat mended. That's hardly showing interest. Martha snorted. Men around here wear their clothes to rags before they'd pay for mending. And the bar seven's got a Chinese cook who can sew well enough. No, he came here specific-like. You mark my words. Ark. Caroline turned away to hide her confusion. She didn't want to mark anyone's words. She didn't want to wonder why a quiet cowboy had ridden 50 miles for a $3 repair. She had a life to build, a business to run a vow to keep. But 2 weeks later, when the bell rang late on a Thursday afternoon, and she looked up to see Silas Boone in her doorway again, something fluttered beneath her ribs that had nothing to do with fear. This time he carried a bundle of clothing, 2 shirts and a pair of trousers, all showing wear. "Miss Caroline," he said in that low, steady voice. "Seems I might need some of that mending after all." She took the bundle, noticing that while the clothes were worn, they were clean. He'd washed them before bringing them to her. Such a simple thing, but it spoke of consideration, of not wanting to burden her with more work than necessary. "These'll take a few days," she said, examining a torn pocket. "I have other orders ahead of yours." "No rush. I'm in town overnight. Got to pick up supplies for the ranch." Which meant he'd have to make another trip to collect them. 50 miles each way, when any of his fellow cowboys would have been happy to bring them back for him. Martha's words echoed. He came here specific-like. "I'll have them ready day after tomorrow," she promised. "Obliged." He started to turn, then paused. "Miss Caroline, I wonder. That is, Mrs. Morrison mentioned you sometimes have remnant fabric. Pieces too small for dresses and such." "I do. Why—" "Well, winter's coming on hard, and some of the boys at the ranch could use. That is, if you had any wool pieces, I'd buy them. For patching." She studied him, noting the careful way he framed the request. Not for himself, but for the boys. She suspected Silas Boone was the kind of man who'd freeze before admitting his own need. "I have a bag of remnants in the back. Let me fetch them." She returned with a flour sack full of fabric pieces, wool, cotton, even some flannel. He examined them seriously, as if selecting remnants required the same attention as choosing horses. "How much for the lot?" 50 cents. It was less than the fabric was worth. But something about this man, his quiet dignity, his refusal to ask for anything outright, made her want to offer what kindness she could within the bounds of propriety. He paid without argument, tucking the bag under his arm. "Thank you, Miss Caroline. This'll help considerable." As he reached the door, she found herself speaking. "Mr. Boone, the hotel dining room serves a decent supper, in case you were wondering where to eat while you're in town." He turned back, and for the first time she saw what might have been surprise in his eyes. "That's kind of you to mention. Good evening, ma'am." That night, as she ate her solitary meal of bread and soup in a room above the shop, Caroline wondered if he'd taken her suggestion. She wondered why she cared. She'd come to Ash Hollow to be alone, to build a life free from the expectations and desires of men. She'd made her vow under the stars, and she meant to keep it. But Silas Boone didn't look at her the way other men did. He didn't push or presume. He simply appeared in her doorway, quiet and courteous, asking for nothing more than the service she advertised. Maybe that was why he unsettled her so. She'd armored herself against pursuit, and proposition steeled herself to refuse and reject. But what defense did she have against a man who asked for nothing at all? Cold night's warm thread. October arrived in Ash Hollow with teeth. The wind that swept down from the mountains carried the promise of hard winter, rattling windows and finding every gap in the walls. Caroline woke one morning to find frost etching delicate patterns on her bedroom window and her water pitcher skinned with ice. She dressed quickly, layering a wool shawl over her everyday dress, and hurried downstairs to light the stove in the shop. Her breath misted in the cold air as she worked to coax warmth from the stubborn wood. This would be her first winter in Wyoming, and already she could tell it would be nothing like the mild seasons she'd known in Texas. The bell above her door chimed just as she'd gotten a good fire going. She looked up, expecting one of her regular customers, but found young Timothy Patterson from the Bar 7 ranch, his nose red with cold. "Morning, Miss Caroline," the boy said, stomping his feet on her threshold. "Mr. Boone sent me with this." He held out a burlap sack, heavy and lumpy. "What is it?" she asked, taking the bag. "Potatoes, ma'am, from the ranch stores. Mr. Boone said. The boy scrunched his face, trying to remember exactly. He said winter's coming hard and potatoes make good soup for cold days. Inside the sack, she found not just potatoes, but also a few onions and carrots, vegetables that would keep well through the cold months. Tucked among them was a small piece of paper with writing in a careful, unpracticed hand. For soup on cold days. S.B. Caroline stared at the note, her fingers tracing the simple words. In the weeks since Silas Boone had first come to her shop, he'd returned 3 more times, always with legitimate mending needs, always courteous and distant. But this was different. This was provision care. The kind of gesture that implied, what? "Is Mr. Boone in town?" she asked Timothy. "No, ma'am. He sent me special. Said I was to deliver this and not dawdle." The boy shifted from foot to foot. "Also said to tell you he'll be down next week with a monthly supply run if you need anything brought from the ranch." "Thank him for me," Caroline managed. "And here," she reached for the jar where she kept peppermint sticks, a small indulgence she allowed herself. "For your trouble." The boy's face lit up as he accepted the candy. After he left, Caroline stood holding the sack of vegetables, uncertainty churning in her stomach. She'd accepted gifts from men before, flowers from Josiah ribbons and trinkets from boys who'd courted her in Texas. But those had come with expectations, with pressure and presumption. This sack of potatoes felt different. It asked for nothing. It simply acknowledged that winter was coming and she might need sustenance. That evening she made soup as suggested, the small room above her shop, filling with the homey smell of simmering vegetables. As she ate her simple meal, she found herself thinking of Silas Boone in his isolated ranch, probably eating similar fare. Did he too sit alone with his thoughts as the cold pressed against the windows? The following week brought the first real storm of the season. Snow fell steadily for 2 days, transforming Ash Hollow into a muffled white world. Caroline kept her shop open, though few ventured out. She used the quiet time to work on a quilt, piecing together remnants from various projects into something that would add warmth to her bed. On the 3rd day, the snow stopped, but the cold intensified. She was bent over her quilting when the door burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and Silas Boone. He looked different, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something urgent. Snow clung to his coat and hat, and his face was reddened by cold and exertion. "Miss Caroline," he said without preamble, "I need your help, if you're willing." "What's wrong?" She set aside her sewing, alarmed by his manner. "There's a family, the Kowalskis, stuck at Bone Creek Crossing. Polish folks heading for the railroad camps. Their wagon broke an axle and the woman's about to—" He stopped, color rising in his already wind-burned cheeks. "She's in a family way. Due any time. They need shelter and someone who knows about women's matters." Caroline was already reaching for her cloak. "How far?" 3 miles north. I've got a sledge. The men from the ranch are fixing their wagon, but we need to get the family somewhere warm." "My room's upstairs," Caroline said immediately. "They can stay there." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or approval. "You sure folks might talk?" "Let them." She was already gathering supplies, clean linens, her sewing scissors sharp, and boiled clean the bottle of laudanum she kept for emergencies. A woman shouldn't birth a baby in a snowbank because of gossip. The ride to Bone Creek tested every ounce of courage Caroline possessed. Silas handled the horses expertly, but the sledge lurched and skidded on the icy trail. She huddled beside him on the narrow seat, grateful for the warmth of his presence, even as she maintained a careful distance. They found the Kowalski family huddled in their disabled wagon, a man, his pregnant wife, and 2 small children. The woman was pale, but not yet in active labor, though the strain showed in her face. "Thank God," her husband said in accented English. "My Maria, she need help." Caroline climbed into the wagon and took the woman's hands. "I'm Caroline. We're going to get you somewhere warm and safe." The journey back seemed endless. Maria Kowalski gripped Caroline's hand as the sledge bounced over ruts, occasionally crying out in Polish. The children huddled against their father, wide-eyed with cold and fear. Once in town, Silas carried Maria up the narrow stairs to Caroline's rooms as easily as if she weighed nothing. Caroline directed him to place her on the bed, then sent him back down for water and wood. "You'll need help," he said quietly. "Should I fetch Mrs. Morrison?" Caroline thought of the mayor's wife, proper and judgmental. "No, but perhaps Martha Olson if she's willing." He nodded and disappeared. Caroline turned to Maria, switching to the soothing tone she'd heard ranch women use during difficult calvings. It wasn't the same, of course, but the principle held: stay calm. Move steady, trust the natural process. Martha arrived within minutes, took one look at the situation and rolled up her sleeves. "Haven't delivered a baby in 15 years, but I reckon it's like riding a horse. Jan," she called to Maria's husband, "you take those young ones down to my store. This is women's work now." For the next 6 hours, Caroline discovered reserves she didn't know she possessed. Maria's labor progressed slowly, complicated by cold and exhaustion. Caroline boiled water, tore linens for bandages, held Maria's hands through the pains. Martha proved surprisingly gentle, murmuring encouragements in the mix of English and gestures that formed frontier communication. Through it all, Caroline was aware of Silas downstairs in the shop. She could hear him tending the stove, the steady rhythm of wood being split, the quiet murmur of his voice as he spoke with Jan Kowalski. He never came up respecting the boundary of women's work, but his presence was oddly comforting. Near midnight, Maria's baby finally arrived, a healthy girl who announced her presence with lusty cries that probably carried to the saloon 3 blocks away. Caroline wrapped the infant in the softest fabric. She had a piece of blue flannel she'd been saving for something special. "Beautiful," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held her daughter. "Thank you, miss. Thank you." When things had settled and Martha had gone home, Caroline crept downstairs to find Silas still there, sitting in the chair by her cutting table. He'd removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves, and she noticed for the first time the repair work he'd done on his shirt, careful even stitches that spoke of long practice. "All well?" he asked, rising as she entered. "Yes, a healthy girl. They're resting now." He nodded, reaching for his coat. "I'll bring the wagon round in the morning, take them onto the railroad camp. Weather should hold." "Mr. Boone," she said as he headed for the door. "Thank you for bringing them here, for staying." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "You did the real work, Miss Caroline. I just split some wood." "You did more than that." He turned then, and in the lamplight she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not desire exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he saw past her carefully constructed walls to the woman beneath. "So did you," he said quietly. Not many would open their home to strangers, risk their reputation. A baby doesn't care about reputations. "No." A slight smile touched his lips. "I reckon baby's got the right idea about what matters." He settled his hat on his head. "Good night, Miss Caroline." After he left, she stood in her empty shop, aware suddenly of how the space still held his presence, the neat stack of split wood, the banked fire in the stove, the faint scent of leather and snow. Her rooms upstairs were full of the Kowalski family, the air rich with the sounds of new life. But down here in her carefully ordered world, something had shifted. She picked up the shirt he'd been wearing, left behind when he'd changed into dry clothes, from his saddlebags. The repair work was indeed expertly done. She ran her fingers over the stitches, thinking of his large hands making these tiny, precise movements. A man who could mend his own clothes didn't need a seamstress. So why did he keep coming back? The next morning brought sunshine and the kind of crystalline cold that made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Silas arrived early with the repaired wagon. The Kowalski family descended her stairs slowly, Maria clutching her new daughter Jan, carrying their belonging. "We never forget," Maria said, pressing Caroline's hands. "Never forget kindness." As they prepared to leave, Silas drew Caroline aside. "They'll need supplies for the journey. I wondered." He pulled out his worn purse. "Would you trust me to buy what's needed from the general store? Add it to their wagon without saying who it's from." Caroline looked at him, this quiet man who split wood without being asked, who recognized need without demanding gratitude. Why anonymously? He shrugged slightly. "Man's got his pride. Hard enough accepting help without feeling beholden." She thought of her own pride, her fierce independence, her determination to need no one. I understand. Together they quietly supplied the wagon with flour beans, salt pork, and blankets. Jan Kowalski's eyes widened when he saw the additions, but Silas just mumbled something about ranch surplus and refused to hear thanks. As the wagon rolled away, baby cries mixing with the creak of wheels, Caroline stood beside Silas watching them go. "That was well done," she said softly. "Was nothing, just neighbors helping neighbors." She turned to look at him. "Is that what we are, neighbors?" He met her gaze steadily. "I reckon that's up to you, Miss Caroline. I'm just a cowboy who needs his mending done." But he was more than that now, and they both knew it. He was the man who brought potatoes for soup, who stayed through a difficult night, who understood about pride and the careful dance of accepting help. "Your shirt," she remembered. "From last night. I'll wash and return it." "No need. I've got others." Still, she wouldn't let him refuse this small service. "Come by end of the week. I'll have it ready." He nodded, touched his hat, and headed for the livery where his horse waited. Caroline watched him go, then turned back to her shop. The Kowalski baby's cries still seemed to echo in the air, a reminder that her carefully solitary world had been breached not by force or demand, but by simple human need. That night, as she worked by lamplight patching his shirt, not because it needed it, but because her hands needed something to do, she thought about walls and bridges, about the cold that waited outside and the warmth that could be shared. She thought about Silas Boone and his quiet ways, his refusal to presume or push. Her vow remained unchanged. Her first night still belonged to no one but herself. But perhaps she thought as her needle moved through worn fabric, perhaps there were other things that could be shared without breaking that promise. Soup on cold days, help in times of need, the simple recognition of one careful soul by another. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Winter was settling in for a long stay, but for the first time since arriving in Ash Hollow, Caroline didn't feel quite so alone in facing it. The offer she refused. November brought the town's annual Harvest Festival, though what harvest anyone celebrated in this hard country was a mystery to Caroline. The growing season was short, the soil unforgiving, but people needed their rituals, their reasons to gather and pretend life held more than mere survival. Mayor Morrison's wife swept into the shop on a Tuesday morning, her cheeks flushed with importance and cold air. "Caroline, dear," she began, though they'd never progressed to such familiarity before. "The Harvest Festival is this Saturday at our home, the biggest event of the season. Everyone who matters will be there." Caroline continued pinning the hem she was working on. "That sounds lovely for those attending." "Well, naturally you'll come." It wasn't a question. "A young woman in your position needs to be seen at social events. It's good for business." "My business does well enough." Mrs. Morrison's smile tightened. "Come now, don't be stubborn. The Hendersons will be there and Judge Crawford's family. Even Mr. Patterson from the Bar 7 usually makes an appearance. All potential customers." Caroline set down her pins carefully. She knew what this was really about. An unmarried woman who kept to herself was an irregularity, a puzzle the town matrons couldn't solve. The festival would be their chance to parade her before eligible men, to fold her into the fabric of proper society. "Thank you for thinking of me, Mrs. Morrison, but I have work to finish." "On a Saturday evening," the woman's tone sharpened. "Caroline, I'm trying to help you. People talk, you know, about a young woman living alone, keeping strange hours, refusing social invitations. It doesn't look well." "I'm not concerned with how it looks." Mrs. Morrison drew herself up. "Perhaps you should be. This isn't Boston or San Francisco. In a town like Ash Hollow, reputation matters. I'd hate to see yours compromised." The threat was subtle, but clear. Caroline met the woman's gaze steadily. "My reputation is my concern, Mrs. Morrison. Now, did you want to discuss the alterations to your winter cape?" After the woman left in a huff, Caroline sat at her sewing machine, hands trembling slightly. She'd known this would come eventually, the pressure to conform to play the role expected of her. In Texas, she'd almost fallen into that trap. Here, she'd sworn to resist it. But resistance came with a price. 2 days later, Silas Boone arrived with a pair of work pants that needed patching. He entered quietly, as always, but Caroline noticed he seemed hesitant, almost uncertain. "Miss Caroline," he said after she'd examined the pants and quoted a price, "I wondered if you might— that is, there's something I wanted to ask." Her heart sped up, though she kept her expression neutral. Was he too about to pressure her about the festival? Suggest she needed a proper escort? "The Harvest Festival," he continued, and her heart sank. "Mayor Morrison's expecting me to attend. Ranch business, he holds the note on some of our grazing land." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm not much for social gatherings." "Nor am I," Caroline said carefully. "Thing is—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "They'll have music, dancing, everyone paired up and talking about nothing in particular. I generally spend such evenings counting the minutes till I can politely leave." She waited, unsure where this was leading. "I thought maybe if you're not attending, I might sit out on the Morrisons' porch instead. It's peaceful there. You can hear the music without being in the thick of things." He met her eyes briefly. "Wouldn't be improper, just sitting, but it might be less lonesome than sitting alone." Caroline stared at him, processing this unexpected turn. He wasn't asking her to the festival. He was suggesting they avoid it together. "I'm not attending," she said slowly. "Mrs. Morrison made it clear I should, but you've got your own mind about things." A slight smile touched his lips. "I respect that. If you're obligated to go, I'm obligated to make an appearance. Nothing says I have to dance or make conversation. If someone happened to be sitting on the porch when I stepped out for air, well, that's just coincidence." She shouldn't even consider it. She'd refused the festival to avoid exactly these kinds of entanglements. But something about his approach, offering companionship without demands, respecting her choice while finding a way around it, appealed to her. "I don't attend social events, Mr. Boone. I don't dance or make conversation with eligible men at parties." "Good thing I'm not eligible, then." At her startled look, he clarified, "Not looking for a wife, Miss Caroline. Not looking for anything except maybe a few minutes' peace with someone who understands the value of silence." She studied him, this contradiction of a man who mended his own clothes but rode 50 miles for her to do it, who provided potatoes for soup but asked for nothing in return. "If I happen to take an evening walk," she said carefully, "and if I happen to rest on the Morrisons' porch because my feet were tired, that would just be coincidence." "Powerful lot of coincidences in this world," he agreed solemnly. Saturday arrived crisp and clear, the kind of November evening that made the stars look close enough to touch. Caroline closed her shop at the usual time and ate her usual simple supper. But as darkness fell and music drifted from the Morrison house 3 streets over, she found herself restless. She didn't dress up that would suggest intent. She simply wrapped her everyday shawl around her shoulders and stepped out for air. The streets were mostly empty. Everyone gathered at the festival. Light spilled from the Morrisons' windows, and she could hear laughter, the scrape of fiddles, the stamp of dancing feet. The porch was deep and wrapped around 2 sides of the house. She chose the darker side away from the main entrance and settled onto a bench half hidden by a trellis of dead roses. She'd been sitting perhaps 10 minutes when bootsteps approached. Silas emerged from the shadows, moving with his characteristic quiet purpose. He dressed for the occasion, clean shirt vest, his good coat, but he looked as uncomfortable as a wolf in a parlor. "Miss Caroline," he said, touching his hat. "Mr. Boone, taking some air." "Seems so." He gestured to the bench. "Mind if I sit? My feet are mighty tired from all that standing around inside." She shifted to make room, careful to maintain proper distance. He sat with a sigh, stretching out his long legs. For a while, they simply sat in companionable silence. The music washed over them, reels and waltzes, punctuated by laughter and the clink of glasses. Through the windows, Caroline could see couples dancing, women in their best dresses, spinning like flowers in the lamplight. "You dance?" Silas asked eventually. "I know how. My father insisted I learn." She paused, remembering those lessons, her father's patient instruction. But knowing how and wanting to are different things. "True enough." He was quiet for a moment. I learned in the army. Sergeant said a man ought to know how to hold a rifle and hold a woman proper on a dance floor. Never had much use for the second skill. You were in the army. 5 years, after the war. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. Everyone had things they'd rather not discuss. A burst of laughter came from inside as someone told a joke. Through the window, Caroline saw Mrs. Morrison scanning the crowd, probably looking for her. She's going to be disappointed, Caroline murmured. She'll survive it. Might even learn something about leaving folks be. They fell silent again. The night was cold but not bitter, and his presence beside her created a small pocket of warmth. Not physical, they sat a proper distance apart, but something else. Understanding, perhaps, or simple acceptance. Why did you really come tonight? She asked suddenly. He considered the question, his profile sharp against the light from the windows. Honestly, hoped you might be here. Not inside, knew you better than that, but somewhere around. Figured you might appreciate knowing you weren't the only one who'd rather be elsewhere. And if I hadn't come? Then I'd have sat here alone, listened to the music, and headed home when I couldn't politely stay away any longer. He turned to look at her. Either way seemed better than dancing with the mayor's daughter or listening to ranchers argue about cattle prices. A waltz began inside, slow and sweet. Through the windows, couples moved together in practiced steps. Caroline watched them with a mix of wistfulness and relief. She'd made her choice, but sometimes the lonely path seemed very long. I don't regret refusing, she said, not sure if she meant the festival invitation or something larger. Didn't figure you did. You're not the type to do things you don't believe in. How do you know what type I am? He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, same way you know about me, I reckon. By what we don't do as much as what we do. The truth of that settled between them. They were defined by their refusals, his refusal to drink and carouse like other cowboys, her refusal to play the role of marriageable young woman. In a frontier town that demanded conformity for survival, they were gentle rebels. Miss Caroline, he said after another stretch of quiet. I want you to know this doesn't change anything. Come Monday, I'll bring my mending and pay my bill same as always. No expectations, no presumptions. This is just what it is. Two people who happen to rest on the same porch. Exactly. The church bell chimed 9 o'clock. Inside, the dancing continued, but Silas stirred. Best head back in for a bit. Make sure Morrison sees me talk about grazing rights. He stood, then hesitated. You'll be all right. I've been looking after myself for some time now. I know, just... He seemed to struggle for words. This was nice. The sitting, the quiet. Yes, she agreed softly. It was. He touched his hat and disappeared around the corner of the house. A moment later, she saw him through the windows, shaking hands with Mayor Morrison, nodding gravely at whatever the man was saying. He looked utterly out of place among the dressed-up townspeople, but he bore it with quiet dignity. Caroline rose and slipped away into the darkness. The walk home seemed shorter than usual, her mind full of the evening's strange peace. She'd refused the festival but found something better, an hour of honest companionship with no strings attached. Back in her room, she prepared for bed with unusual care, brushing out her hair, washing her face with the last of her rose water. In the mirror, she looked the same as always, a young woman alone defending her independence with fierce determination. But something had shifted. She'd discovered it was possible to share space with another person without surrendering herself. To accept companionship without obligation. To refuse the party but still hear the music. As she lay in bed, she heard late revelers passing in the street, their voices raised in drink and song. Tomorrow, the town gossips would note her absence from the festival, tut over her unsociable ways. They'd never know about the porch, the quiet conversation, the understanding between two people who asked for nothing more than what was freely given. Let them talk, Caroline thought, pulling her quilt up against the cold. She had her shop, her work, her carefully guarded independence. And now she had something else, the knowledge that somewhere in this hard country was another soul who understood the value of sitting quiet on a porch, refusing to dance to anyone's tune but their own. The music from the Morrison house finally faded as the festival wound down. Caroline closed her eyes and for the first time in months didn't feel entirely alone. The storm and the gunshot. December brought the kind of storm that old-timers talked about for years after. It started innocently enough, fat snowflakes drifting down like feathers on a Tuesday afternoon. By evening, the wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontal. By nightfall, Ash Hollow was buried in white fury. Caroline had closed the shop early, sensing the storm's approach. She'd stocked wood, filled her water pitcher, and prepared for a long siege. The building creaked and groaned under the wind's assault, but it held firm. She worked by lamplight, finishing a christening gown for the banker's new grandson, trying not to think about how isolated she was in this weather. The gunshot, when it came, was muffled by the storm, but unmistakable. Then another and another. Caroline's hand stilled on the delicate fabric. Gunfire wasn't unusual in Ash Hollow cowboys, celebrating disputes settled with lead instead of words. But this was different. These shots had the rhythm of real trouble. She moved to the window but could see nothing through the driving snow. More shots rang out closer now, followed by shouting that the wind tore away before she could make out words. Then, for a long moment, silence except for the storm's howl. A pounding at her door made her jump. Not the polite knock of a customer, but desperate hammering. "Miss Caroline, open up, please." She recognized the voice young Timothy Patterson from the bar 7. Without thinking, she unbolted the door. The boy practically fell inside, covered in snow, his face white with cold and fear. "Timothy what?" "It's Mr. Boone, miss. He's hurt bad. There was trouble at the saloon men from Carson City causing problems. They went after the Murphy boy, said he cheated at cards. He's only 15, miss." Mr. Boone stepped in and the boy's voice cracked. "They shot him. Got him in the shoulder, maybe the chest. He's at Doc Hartley's, but Doc's drunk again and—" Caroline was already reaching for her cloak. "Where are the men who did this?" "Sheriff's got 2 of them. The third ran off in the storm." Timothy grabbed her arm as she headed for the door. "Miss, it's not safe. There's blood all over the snow, and folks are scared and—" "Is Silas dying?" The use of his first name didn't even register. I don't know. He was conscious when we carried him to Doc's, but he looked awful pale." Caroline pulled her medical supplies from the shelf, the same ones she'd used for Maria Kowalski. Clean linen scissors, the bottle of laudanum, a needle, and thread she prayed she wouldn't need. "You did right coming to me," she told Timothy. "Now get yourself by the stove and warm up. I'm going to Doc Hartley's." But missed the storm. She was already out the door. The wind nearly knocked her down the moment she stepped outside. Snow stung her face like tiny needles, and the cold stole her breath. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but she knew the way to Doc Hartley's 2 blocks down 1 block over. She kept one hand on the buildings as she fought through the drifts, her skirts quickly becoming heavy with snow. The doctor's house was lit but quiet. She pounded on the door until someone opened it. Mrs. Garrett, the minister's wife, her face grave. "Caroline, what do you never mind? Come in. We need all the help we can get." The scene inside was barely controlled chaos. Doc Hartley sat slumped in a chair, reeking of whiskey, mumbling incoherently. Several townsmen stood around looking helpless. And on the examination table lay Silas Boone, his shirt cut away, blood seeping through a rough bandage on his left shoulder. His eyes were closed, his face gray as weathered wood. For a moment, Caroline thought they were too late. Then she saw the slight rise and fall of his chest. "Thank God you're here," said Robert Morrison, the mayor's son. "Doc's been drinking since noon. We've tried to stop the bleeding, but—" Caroline pushed past him, her fear crystallizing into purpose. She'd helped her father tend injured ranch hands. She'd watched Maria Kowalski bring life into the world. She could do this. "Get me hot water," she ordered. "Lots of it. And clean cloth, tear up sheets if you have to. She pointed to one of the men. Hold that lamp closer. I need to see what we're dealing with." She peeled back the blood-soaked bandage, steeling herself against what she might find. The wound was high on his shoulder, still seeping but not pumping blood. That was good, no major vessels hit. But it was deep, and she could see fabric from his shirt driven into the wound. "The bullet?" she asked. "Doc got it out before he passed out entirely," Robert said. "Least he managed that." Small mercies. Caroline began cleaning the wound with steady hands that belied her racing heart. Tell me what happened. As she worked, Robert explained. 3 men from Carson City had ridden in despite the storm, already drunk and looking for trouble. They'd accused young Sean Murphy of cheating at poker, started roughing him up. Silas had been at the bar minding his own business as usual. He told them to leave the boy alone, Robert said. Come as you please. They laughed at him, called him a worn-out cowpoke, told him to mind his business. That's when one of them pulled a knife on the Murphy boy. Caroline's hands never paused as she picked fabric from the wound with tweezers she'd sterilized in the lamp flame. Silas groaned, but didn't wake. Mr. Boone moved faster than I've ever seen a man move, Robert continued. Had that knife man on the floor before anyone could blink. But one of his friends pulled a gun. Mr. Boone saw it shove the boy out of the way. Took the bullet himself. And the men? Sheriff got 2 when they tried to run. The 3rd made it to his horse. Robert's voice hardened. He won't get far in this storm. If the cold doesn't get him, a posse will. Caroline finished cleaning the wound and threaded her needle. This was the part she dreaded, sewing human flesh like fabric. But it had to be done. Hold him down, she said quietly. This is going to hurt. The men positioned themselves to keep Silas still. Caroline took a breath, said a prayer to whoever might be listening, and began to stitch. Silas came awake with a roar of pain. His eyes flew open wild and unfocused, and he tried to surge up off the table. Hold him, Caroline commanded, never stopping her work. Silas, it's Caroline. You're safe. I need you to be still. His eyes found hers, and something in her face must have reached him through the pain. He stopped fighting, though his jaw clenched so tight she feared he'd crack teeth. That's it, she murmured, continuing her careful stitches. Just a bit more. You're doing fine. The boy, he managed through gritted teeth. Safe, thanks to you. He closed his eyes, a slight relaxation in his features. Caroline finished the stitching, applied a clean bandage, and finally stepped back. Her hands were trembling now that the immediate crisis had passed. He needs to be kept warm and still, she said. The wound's clean and closed, but fever's the danger now. We can't move him in this storm, Robert said. Doc's got a room upstairs. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. Not here. Not with Doc in this condition. She made a decision that would have the gossips talking for months. Bring him to my place. I've got a clean bed and a warm stove. Miss Caroline, Mrs. Garrett protested. That's not proper. Neither is letting a man die for propriety's sake. Caroline was already gathering supplies. He saved that boy's life. The least we can do is give him a fighting chance. An hour later, they'd managed to transport Silas through the storm to her shop. Getting him up the narrow stairs was a struggle, but finally they had him settled in her bed, covered with every quilt she owned. I'll stay, Robert offered, but Caroline shook her head. You've got a wife and children waiting. I've nursed injured men before. At their skeptical looks, she added, on my father's ranch. This isn't my first gunshot wound. After they left, she was alone with Silas Boone in her bedroom, a situation that would have scandalized her younger self. But that girl felt like a stranger now. All that mattered was the man fighting for his life in her bed. She pulled her rocking chair close and settled in for a long vigil. The storm raged outside, sealing them in a world of lamplight and shadow. Silas's breathing was rough but steady. She bathed his face with cool water, checked his bandage, counted his breaths. Near dawn, the fever struck. He tossed restlessly, mumbling words she couldn't catch. She spooned water between his cracked lips, changed the sweat-soaked bandages, fought to keep him anchored to life. In his delirium, he spoke more than she'd ever heard from him. Names of men, army comrades, she guessed. Something about a river crossing, horses screaming. Once he called for his mother, his voice young and lost. Shh, Caroline murmured, bathing his burning face. You're safe. Rest now. His eyes opened, focused on her with surprising clarity. Caroline? Yes, I'm here. You shouldn't, not proper. Hush. Nothing about this night has been proper. A ghost of his rare smile touched his lips. No, suppose not. His hand found hers grip weak but present. Thank you. Rest, she said again, but didn't pull her hand away. The fever broke near sunset the next day. Caroline had dozed in her chair, exhausted from the vigil, when a change in his breathing woke her. She found him watching her truly conscious for the first time. "How long?" he asked, voice rough. 2 days. The storm's passed." He tried to sit up, grimaced, and fell back. "The Murphy boy is fine, telling everyone how you saved him." She helped him sip some water. "You nearly died, you know. That was foolish." "Maybe." He studied her face, taking in her exhaustion, her mussed hair, the impropriety of the situation. "Your reputation is my concern, as I've told everyone who'll listen." She set the water aside. "Are you hungry? I have some broth." As she turned to go, he caught her hand. "Caroline, what you've done, I won't forget." She looked down at their joined hands, his calloused and scarred, hers stained with his blood despite repeated washings. "You'd have done the same." "Maybe, but you did it." He released her hand slowly. "Won't forget," he repeated. Downstairs, she heated the broth and tried to compose herself. In novels, nursing a wounded man led to declarations of love, dramatic revelations. But this wasn't a novel. This was real life, complicated and messy. She'd saved him because it was right, because she couldn't bear to lose one of the few people in Ash Hollow who understood her need for independence. That didn't change anything. It couldn't. But as she climbed the stairs with the broth, she admitted to herself that something had shifted. She'd let him into her most private space, tended his body with her own hands, heard his delirious secrets. The careful distance she maintained with the world had been breached by necessity. She found him attempting to sit up again, face tight with pain, but determined. "You're going to tear those stitches," she warned, setting down the tray to help him. "Can't stay here. People will talk." "They're already talking. Have been since I arrived in town." She propped pillows behind him, businesslike in her movements. "A few more days won't matter." He accepted the broth, let her help him eat, though she could see it chafed at his pride. Between spoonfuls, he said quietly, "I meant what I said. Won't forget this. If you ever need anything." "I don't do favors to collect debts, Mr. Boone." "Silas," he corrected. "Think we're past formalities, don't you?" She met his eyes, saw something there that made her heart skip. "Perhaps we are." But even as she acknowledged the shift, she held tight to her resolve. She'd saved his life, yes. She'd tend him until he was well. But her vow remained. Her first night belonged to no one but herself. Still, as she watched him eat color slowly returning to his face, she allowed herself one moment of dangerous honesty. In another life, another world, a man like Silas Boone might have been someone she could trust with more than just her nursing skills. But this was the life she'd chosen, and she would live it on her own terms. Even if those terms were getting harder to remember with each passing day. A bed by the fire. The fever returned that night, fierce and sudden. Caroline had been dozing in her chair when Silas's restless movements woke her. His skin burned beneath her hand, and his eyes held that glassy, unfocused look she'd learned to fear. "No good," he muttered, tossing his head on the pillow. "Can't cross here. Water's too high." She wrung out a cloth in cool water, bathing his face and neck.
"Shh, you're safe. There's no river."
But he was lost in some memory, some long-ago trauma playing out behind his fevered eyes. "Get the horses back. Thompson, get those horses." He tried to sit up, face contorted with urgency.
"Silas."
She pressed him gently back down.
"It's Caroline. You're in Ash Hollow. You're safe."
His eyes found hers, struggled to focus.
"Caroline?"
The name came out broken, uncertain. "You shouldn't be here. Not right for you to—" "Hush now." She continued her ministrations, the cool cloth against burning skin. "Rest." The church bell tolled midnight, its bronze voice carrying clear through the winter air. The storm had passed, leaving Ash Hollow buried in white silence. Caroline had kept the stove burning hot, but still the cold pressed against the windows, seeking entry. She'd sent Timothy to the Bar 7 with news of Silas's condition. The boy had returned with a message from the ranch foreman, "Take whatever time needed. We'll manage." Also brought were clean clothes for Silas and an envelope with money for his care, which Caroline had promptly sent back. Now, in the deep of night, she kept her vigil. The chair was uncomfortable. Her back ached and exhaustion weighed on her like a physical thing. But she couldn't leave him, not with the fever raging. Somewhere near 3 in the morning, Silas's breathing changed. The restlessness eased, replaced by a stillness that sent fear shooting through her. She leaned close, relief flooding her when she felt his breath against her cheek. "Water," he whispered. She helped him drink, supporting his head with practiced care. When he lay back, his eyes were clearer. "How long this time?" "Few hours. The fever comes and goes." He noticed her drawn face, the shadows beneath her eyes. "When did you last sleep, real sleep in a bed?" "I'm fine." "Liar." The word held no sting, only concern. "You'll make yourself sick wearing yourself out like this." "I've been sick before. I survived." He studied her, this woman who'd opened her home to scandal rather than let him suffer in Doc Hartley's squalor. "Why?" he asked simply. She understood the question. Why risk everything? Why breach her carefully maintained walls? Why care so much about a taciturn cowboy who paid for mending he could do himself? "You saved that boy," she said finally. "That's not why." She met his gaze, surprised by the challenge there. Even weak as he was, he wouldn't accept easy answers. "No," she admitted. "That's not why." They looked at each other across the lamplight. Two people who'd built their lives on solitude, suddenly confronted with connection. Caroline felt exposed, as if he could see through to all the secret hopes and fears she'd buried. "I couldn't let you die," she said quietly. "Not when I could help? Not you?" He lifted his hand slightly, and she took it without thinking. His fingers were hot with fever, but steady. "I'm not dying, Caroline. Too stubborn for that." "Good." Her voice came out rougher than intended. "Because I've ruined my reputation nursing you. Least you can do is survive." A slight smile touched his lips. "Fair enough." The fever ebbed as dawn approached, leaving him weak but lucid. Caroline finally allowed herself to doze still in the chair, still holding his hand. She woke to find him watching her, an expression on his face she couldn't quite read. "You need a proper bed," he said. "I'll take the chair." "You'll do no such thing. You can barely sit up without help." "Then we have a problem." His tone was light, but she heard the concern beneath. "You can't keep sleeping in that chair." "I've slept in worse places." She rose, stretching muscles stiff from the awkward position. "I'll make some breakfast. You need to eat." Downstairs, she built up the fire in the shop stove and set water to boil. Through the front window, she could see townspeople beginning to dig out from the storm. Martha Olson was already sweeping her storefront, and she raised a hand in greeting when she spotted Caroline. The normalcy of it felt strange after the intensity of the sick room. Out there, life continued business, to conduct gossip, to share proprieties, to observe. In here, those rules had been suspended by necessity. When she returned upstairs with porridge and tea, she found Silas attempting to shave himself with her hand mirror and his razor from the belongings Timothy had brought. "You're going to hurt yourself," she protested, setting down the tray. "Man's got his dignity," he muttered, wincing as he lifted his arm. "Bad enough you've had to tend me like a child." "Oh, for heaven's sake." She took the razor from him, exasperated. "Dignity won't keep you warm if you tear those stitches and bleed to death." Before she could think better of it, she lathered the soap and began shaving him herself. He went very still, watching her with those gray eyes as she wielded the razor with careful strokes. "You've done this before," he observed. "My father, when he was ill." She concentrated on the task, trying not to think about the intimacy of it. "Hold still." She worked in silence, aware of his breathing, the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. When she finished, she wiped away the last of the soap and stepped back quickly. "There, much better than bleeding to death for the sake of dignity." "Caroline?" His voice stopped her as she turned away. What you're doing, I know what it costs. The talk, the judgment. I'll make it right somehow." She turned back, something fierce kindling in her chest. "You'll make it right how? By offering to marry me to save my reputation? By paying me like I'm some hired nurse?" She shook her head sharply. I didn't do this for payment or promises. I did it because—" She stopped, suddenly aware she'd been about to say too much. "Because," he prompted gently. "Because you're the only person in this town who's never asked anything of me I wasn't willing to give." The words came out in a rush. "You've never pushed or presumed or suggested I need saving. You just let me be." "And I always will," he said quietly. "That hasn't changed." "Hasn't it?" She gestured around the room at the impropriety of their situation. "After this, how can it not change?" He considered this, then held out his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. "Listen to me," he said, his grip firm despite his weakness. "What you've done here, it's a gift. One I can never repay, but it doesn't create obligation. Not for either of us. When I'm well, I'll go back to the bar 7. You'll go back to your shop. We'll be what we've always been, two people who understand the value of leaving each other be." "And if I don't want that?" The question escaped before she could stop it. His eyes widened slightly, but he didn't release her hand. "Then you tell me what you do want, and I'll listen. But Caroline," his thumb brushed across her knuckles, the lightest touch, "don't change for me. Don't break promises you made to yourself. Not for me, not for anyone." She stood frozen, caught between old vows and new longings. Through the window came the sound of normal life wheels in snow voices calling greetings, the world moving on. But in this room, time had stopped. "I need to check your bandage," she said finally, gently withdrawing her hand. He let her go, understanding her retreat. As she unwound the linen, checking the wound for signs of infection, she felt him watching her. Not with the hunger she'd seen in other men's eyes, but with something deeper and more dangerous recognition. "It's healing well," she said, applying fresh bandage. "Another week, maybe 2, and you'll be able to ride." "Good. Patterson needs every hand for winter feeding." They returned to safer ground ranch business, the weather the fate of the men who'd caused the trouble. She fed him breakfast, pleased to see his appetite returning. But beneath the mundane conversation ran an awareness that hadn't been there before. That evening, as she prepared for another night in the chair, he stopped her. "Take the bed," he said firmly. "I'll manage in the chair for one night." "Don't be ridiculous. You can barely stand." "Then we share." The words hung in the air between them. "The bed's big enough. You stay on your side, I'll stay on mine. You need proper rest, and we both know it." She stared at him, heat flooding her cheeks. I couldn't." "Couldn't you?" His expression was serious, without a trace of impropriety. "Caroline, you've held my head while I was sick, cleaned my wounds, shaved my face. We've already crossed lines. What's one more if it means you get the rest you need?" She thought of her vow made under stars that seemed a lifetime away. Her first night belonged to no one but herself. But this wasn't about first nights or last nights or any of the things she'd guarded against. This was about two tired people needing rest. "There'll be a pillow between us," she said finally. "And you stay above the covers." Agreed. That night she lay rigid on her side of the bed, listening to his breathing, aware of his presence like a flame in the darkness. The pillow barrier seemed flimsy as paper, but gradually exhaustion won. She slept deeply for the first time in days, and if she woke once to find their hands had somehow found each other across the divide, she didn't pull away. In the morning, she woke first. Pale winter light filtered through the curtains. The pillow had shifted in the night, and she could see his face relaxed in sleep. The harsh lines were softened, making him look younger, more vulnerable. This is dangerous, she thought. More dangerous than any storm or gunshot. But she couldn't seem to move, couldn't break whatever spell held her there, watching him breathe. His eyes opened, found hers immediately. For a moment, neither spoke. The morning air was cold, but beneath the quilts was warmth. The shared heat of two people who'd stopped pretending they were meant to be alone. "Caroline," he said softly. "I know," she whispered. "I know." The hat and the words. Dawn came slowly that morning, painting the snow-covered town in shades of pearl and rose. Caroline had already risen and dressed, moving quietly to avoid waking Silas. She stood at the window watching Ash Hollow come alive, trying to make sense of the night that had passed. They'd slept on opposite sides of the bed, the pillow between them like a frontier neither dared cross. But awareness had hummed in the space between them, more intimate than any touch. She'd lain awake listening to his breathing, knowing he was awake too, both of them pretending otherwise until exhaustion finally claimed them. Now, in the clear light of morning, she heard him stirring. She busied herself with the wash basin, not ready to meet his eyes. "Caroline!" She turned to find him sitting up, his color much improved, though the movement still pained him. He'd managed to pull on the clean shirt Timothy had brought, though the buttons remained undone. "Let me help," she said, moving to fasten them before he could protest. Her fingers worked steadily, though she was acutely aware of his watching her. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "There's nothing to discuss. You needed care, I provided it. In a few days you'll be well enough to leave." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." She finished with the buttons and stepped back. "Then what do you mean?" He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with characteristic care. Then, deliberately, he reached for his hat from the bedside table. He held it in his hands, turning it slowly, and she realized she'd never seen him nervous before. "I'm not a man of many words," he began. "Never learned the pretty ways of talking that come easy to some, but there are things that need saying." Caroline sank into the chair, her heart beating strangely. "Silas!" "Let me finish." He looked up at her, then his gray eyes steadied despite the vulnerability in them. "I came to your shop that first day because I'd heard you did good work." That was truth, but not all of it. "I'd seen you before, walking down Main Street with your chin up and your eyes forward, not looking for anyone's approval. I'd watched you turn away men who thought they had a right to your attention just because you were young and alone." She remembered now those early days when she'd been establishing herself, fighting for respect. She'd been too focused on survival to notice who might be watching. "I kept coming back," he continued, "not because I needed mending, but because you were the first person I'd met who understood that being alone didn't mean being lonely, who knew the difference between solitude and isolation." "But now," she began. "Now nothing's changed." He set his hat aside and leaned forward, wincing slightly. "Caroline, I'm not going to suddenly start making demands because you saved my life. I'm not going to assume rights I haven't earned or expect promises you haven't made." "Then what are you doing?" He was quiet again, gathering himself. Then he picked up his hat once more, and in a gesture she'd seen him make countless times, but never with such deliberation, he removed it as if she were a lady, and he a gentleman in a parlor instead of a wounded cowboy in her bedroom. "I'm saying thank you," he said simply. "Not just for the nursing, but for being who you are. For showing me that caring for someone doesn't have to mean caging them." The morning sun slanted through the window, illuminating the silver threads in his dark hair, the weathered lines of his face. Caroline felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of bonds she'd tied so tightly she'd forgotten they were there. "All my life," she said slowly, "men have looked at me and seen something to possess. My father saw an heir to shape. Josiah saw wealth to steal. Others have seen a challenge to conquer or a prize to win." She met his eyes. "You're the first who's ever looked at me and just seen me. Because that's all I wanted to see." He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she now recognized as his way of working through difficult truths. "I won't lie and say I haven't thought about more, but thinking and expecting are different things." "What if I've thought about it too?" The question hung between them like morning mist, delicate and dangerous. His hand stilled on the hat brim. "Then I'd say we have time to figure out what that means," he said carefully. "I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you. Whatever this is, it doesn't need deciding today." A knock at the shop door below shattered the moment. Caroline rose quickly, grateful and frustrated in equal measure. "That'll be Mrs. Morrison," she said. "She has a fitting this morning." "Caroline." His voice stopped her at the door. "What I said before stands. When I'm healed, I'll go back to the ranch. Come to town same as always. Nothing changes unless you want it to." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and hurried downstairs. Mrs. Morrison swept in full of gossip and false concern. "My dear, the whole town is talking that cowboy in your rooms for days now. I do hope you're being careful about your reputation." My reputation is my own concern, Caroline said, pulling out the woman's half-finished dress. Now, I'm only trying to help. A young woman in your position can't be too careful. Why, I was just telling the Ladies' Aid Society that perhaps we should organize a rotating watch to help you maintain propriety while caring for the poor man. That won't be necessary. Mrs. Morrison's eyes glittered with the joy of scandal barely contained. My dear, you must see how it looks. An unmarried woman, a man in her bed. A man who saved a boy's life and nearly died for it, Caroline interrupted. A man who deserved better than to bleed out in Doc Hartley's squalor. If the town wants to make more of it than that, it says more about the town than about me. The woman huffed but submitted to her fitting. After she left, Caroline found her hands trembling. The reality of what these past days would cost her was becoming clear. In a town like Ash Hollow, reputation was currency, and she'd spent hers freely. She climbed the stairs to find Silas dressed and standing by the window, though he held the wall for support. You should be resting, she said. Heard voices. The mayor's wife. Yes. Come to view the scandal. Something like that. He turned from the window, and she saw anger in his normally calm features. This is what I was afraid of. You suffering for helping me. I made my choice. That doesn't make it right. He moved carefully to the chair, his jaw tight with more than physical pain. I should leave today. The longer I stay, you'll leave when you're healed and not before. She faced him squarely. I've been the subject of gossip since the day I arrived. At least now it's for something worthwhile. He studied her, this woman who'd risked everything to save him. You're remarkable, you know that? I'm practical. There's a difference. No, he said quietly. There's not. Not in you. They spent the day in easier companionship. She worked on orders while he dozed or read from one of the few books she owned. Customers came and went, some clearly hoping for scandal, others genuinely concerned. Through it all, Caroline maintained her composure, neither confirming nor denying the stories circulating. That evening, as she prepared supper, Silas made his way carefully down the stairs. She found him examining her sewing machine with interest. It's good work you do, he said, running a finger along a finished seam. Takes skill to make something beautiful from raw cloth. It's just sewing. No. He looked up at her. It's creation, transformation, taking what is and making it into what could be. She thought about that as they ate their simple meal soup and bread, nothing fancy but filling. Was that what was happening between them? A transformation of two solitary souls into something else. After supper, he insisted on helping clear the dishes, though she could see the effort tired him. As they worked, their movements fell into easy rhythm, as if they'd been sharing domestic tasks for years instead of days. I've been thinking, he said as he dried a plate with careful attention, about what you said, how I don't ask for things you're not willing to give. Yes. Goes both ways. He set the plate aside, turned to face her. I won't give what you don't ask for either. Won't assume or presume. This thing between us, whatever it is or isn't or might become, it has to be what we both choose. Free and clear. And if we choose different things, then we'll still be what we've always been. Two people who understand each other. That's more than most get in this life. She dried her hands, slowly considering. You make it sound simple. Maybe it is. Maybe we're the ones making it complicated. He moved closer, still careful, still leaving space between them. Caroline, I need you to know something. I'm not looking to be saved or to save anyone. I've got no grand plans or promises. All I can offer is what you already know, a man who'll respect your choices, who'll stand beside you without trying to stand in front of you. And if that's enough, she whispered, if that's more than enough. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was light as breath, but she felt it down to her bones. Then we take it day by day, he said. No rushes, no pushes, just possibility. She caught his hand, held it against her cheek for a moment before stepping back. I need time. All you need. He smiled, then the rare full smile she'd seen only glimpses of before. I'm a patient man, Caroline May. Spent 5 years learning to wait in the army. I can wait as long as you need." Later, as they prepared to retire, he to the small cot she'd set up in the corner, she to her bed. He paused at the window. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the snow. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for the doctoring, for all of it, for showing me what it's like to be seen by someone who matters." "Silas." He turned his face half in shadow, half in moonlight. "You matter too," she said simply. Something passed between them then weightier than any vow or promise. An understanding that whatever came next, they'd face it as equals, as two people who'd learned the value of both solitude and connection. That night, Caroline lay in her bed listening to his quiet breathing from across the room. Her vow remained intact. Her first night still belonged to no one but herself. But for the first time since making that promise under the stars, she wondered if perhaps someday she might choose to give what had never been taken. Not because she had to, not because society expected it, but because with the right person, a person who understood that the greatest gift was the freedom to choose sharing might be its own form of independence. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, as sleep finally claimed her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months of careful isolation. Hope. The town divided. Spring came late to Ash Hollow that year, creeping in with tentative warmth and uncertain skies. The snow melted in patches, revealing the muddy truth beneath winter's clean white blanket. Caroline stood at her shop window, watching the transformation, aware that her own life had undergone a similar thaw. It had been 3 months since Silas returned to the Bar 7, 3 months of careful navigation through a town split in its opinion of her. Some, like Martha Olson, stood firmly in her corner. Others, led by Mrs. Morrison and the Ladies' Aid Society, made their disapproval known through pursed lips and turned backs. But Caroline's business hadn't suffered as she'd feared. If anything, it had grown. Women who'd never darkened her doorstep before came seeking her services, some out of curiosity, others out of quiet admiration for a woman who'd risked censure to save a life. Miss Caroline. She turned to find young Helen Morrison, the mayor's daughter, hovering in the doorway. The girl was 16, pretty in the way of youth, but with intelligent eyes that reminded Caroline of herself at that age. "My mother doesn't know I'm here," Helen said, quickly glancing over her shoulder. "But I need a dress for the spring dance. I have money, I saved it from teaching piano lessons." Caroline smiled. "Come in, Helen. Let's see what we can create." As she took the girl's measurements, Helen chattered nervously. "Mother says I shouldn't associate with you, says you're a bad influence, but I think what you did was brave." "I did what needed doing, nothing more." "That's what Mr. Boone said too." Helen's eyes sparkled. "He was at our house last week talking business with Father. Mother tried to get him to condemn your behavior, but he just said a person ought to be judged by their actions, not by others' opinions." Caroline's hand stilled for a moment on the measuring tape. Silas had been in town last week and hadn't come to see her. She pushed down the stab of disappointment. He was keeping his promise, maintaining distance, letting her set the pace. "When you see him next," Helen continued, oblivious to Caroline's reaction, "would you tell him Sean Murphy asks after him? The boy he saved, Sean, says Mr. Boone is a hero, no matter what the gossips say." "I'll tell him if I see him," Caroline said carefully. Helen left with promises to return for a fitting, and Caroline was alone with her thoughts. She'd seen Silas exactly 3 times since his recovery. Each time he'd been courteous but distant, bringing legitimate mending needs and paying without lingering. They'd rebuilt their careful boundaries, but now those boundaries felt more like walls. The bell chimed again, and this time it was someone she didn't expect, Judge Crawford's wife, Elizabeth. The woman was from Eastern society, originally educated and refined in ways that set her apart from most of Ash Hollow's residents. "Mrs. Crawford," Caroline said, surprised. "How can I help you?" "I need a traveling suit," Elizabeth said, removing her gloves with precise movements. "But first I wanted to speak with you about something else." Caroline waited uncertain. "I've been watching the situation with interest," Elizabeth continued. "A young woman establishes herself in business, maintains her independence, saves a man's life at great personal cost, and refuses to bow to social pressure. It's quite admirable." I don't seek admiration, which is precisely why you deserve it. Elizabeth smiled. I'm organizing a literary society. Nothing as stuffy as the Ladies' Aid, just women who appreciate good books and better conversation. We meet Thursday evenings. I'd like you to join us. Caroline blinked. Mrs. Crawford, that's kind, but no buts. You're exactly the sort of member we need. Someone with spine. Elizabeth's eyes twinkled. Besides, I have it on good authority that you own several books. In Ash Hollow, that practically makes you a scholar. Despite herself, Caroline smiled. I'll consider it. Good. Now about that traveling suit. As Caroline worked through the afternoon, she pondered this unexpected development. A literary society. Acceptance from an unexpected quarter. Perhaps the town wasn't as uniformly against her as she'd thought. That evening, as she prepared to close the shop, hoofbeats stopped outside. Her heart leaped, then settled when she saw it was Timothy Patterson, not Silas. Evening, Miss Caroline, the boy said, dismounting. Got something for you. He handed her a wrapped package. Inside was fabric good wool in a deep blue that would bring out her eyes. No note, but she knew who'd sent it. Tell Mr. Boone thank you, she said quietly. Timothy grinned. He said you'd know it was from him. Also said to tell you the literary society is a good idea. Mrs. Crawford asked his opinion, seeing as how he reads everything he can get his hands on. After the boy left, Caroline held the fabric, running her fingers over the fine weave. Silas was watching out for her from a distance, supporting her without intruding. The careful respect of it made her chest tight with emotion she couldn't name. Thursday came, and with it her first literary society meeting. She'd sewn herself a new shirtwaist from the blue wool, pairing it with her best skirt. As she walked to the Crawford house, she noticed the looks, some approving, others disapproving, all curious. The meeting was a revelation. 8 women gathered in Elizabeth Crawford's parlor, discussing books with passion and intelligence. They welcomed Caroline warmly, and she found herself contributing to a spirited debate about Jane Austen's heroines. Elizabeth Bennet had the luxury of refusing Mr. Collins because she had family support, argued Mrs. Wells, the banker's wife. Not all women have such options. Which is precisely why we need to create our own options, Caroline found herself saying. Independence isn't just about money or property. It's about choosing our own paths, even when society disapproves. A murmur of agreement ran through the room. Later, as the meeting broke up, several women approached Caroline privately, thanking her for her words, sharing their own struggles with expectation and propriety. Walking home under the stars, Caroline felt a shift in her understanding. She'd thought standing alone was the only way to maintain her independence, but perhaps there was strength in carefully chosen community too. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Silas himself. He stood in her doorway, hat in hand as always, but there was something different in his manner. Caroline, he said, I heard the literary society went well. News travels fast. It's a small town. He stepped inside, and she noticed he carried no mending. I actually came to ask your advice. Oh. There's a family, the Jacobsons, homesteading up near the ranch. They've got 5 children and another on the way. Lost most of their clothes in a fire last week. He shifted uncomfortably. I wondered if you might know of any way to help, discreetly. Man's got his pride. Caroline studied him, this cowboy, who noticed need and sought to fill it without fanfare. I have remnants, fabric pieces too small for full garments, but perfect for children's clothes, if someone were to buy them and have them made up. How much? For you, cost of thread and notions only. He frowned. That's not fair to you. Neither is children going without clothes. She moved to gather the remnants. Besides, I'll gain more from the goodwill than I'd lose in profit. As she bundled the fabric, he watched her with that steady gaze that still made her stomach flutter. You're building something here, he said quietly. Despite everything, because of everything. The town's changing its mind about you. Some of it. The parts that matter. He accepted the bundle, then surprised her by not immediately turning to leave. Caroline, I've been keeping my distance, trying to give you space. But I need to know, am I giving you what you want, or just what I think you need? The question hung between them, weighted with months of careful restraint.
I don't know,
she admitted.
I thought I wanted to be left alone, but lately...
Lately, she met his eyes. Lately, I wonder if there's a difference between being independent and being isolated. If maybe I've been so focused on protecting myself that I've forgotten what I'm protecting myself for. He set down the bundle and moved closer, still leaving space between them, but less than before. And what do you think you're protecting yourself for?
The right to choose,
she said simply. To give myself my time, my affection, my trust freely. Not because it's expected or demanded, but because I want to. And if you wanted to, if you chose to. Her breath caught.
Then I suppose I would.
He lifted his hand, hesitated, then gently cupped her cheek.
I'm not asking for everything, Caroline.
I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. But I am asking, what do you choose? She leaned into his touch, eyes closing briefly. When she opened them, she saw in his face the same patient hope she'd been carrying.
I choose to try, she whispered, to see what we might be without walls between us, but slowly, carefully.
As slow as you need, he agreed. I'm not going anywhere. He sealed the promise with the briefest kiss to her forehead, then stepped back.
I should get this fabric to Mrs. Jacobson.
Silas, she called as he reached the door. Next week is the spring dance. The Literary Society is hosting a book table to raise funds for a library. I'll be there. He smiled, understanding the invitation implicit in her words. Then so will I. Save me a dance, Caroline May. After he left, she stood in her shop, heart racing like a schoolgirl's. Outside, Ash Hollow went about its business, some citizens approving of her, others not, most simply trying to survive another day on the frontier. But inside, something had fundamentally changed. She'd spent so long defining herself by what she refused marriage dependence vulnerability. Now perhaps it was time to define herself by what she chose connection community, the possibility of love that didn't require surrender. The spring dance was a week away. 7 days to prepare not just her book table, but her heart for whatever came next. 7 days to practice being Caroline May Latimer, independent woman who might also be a woman in love. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. But for the first time since she'd fled Texas with nothing but determination and fear, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Not alone, but on her own terms. Always on her own terms. The dance she chose. The morning of the spring dance arrived with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Caroline stood before her mirror, holding up the dress she'd made from the fabric Silas had sent. She'd worked on it in secret moments between other orders, pouring into each stitch the hope and uncertainty that had been building for weeks. The dress was simple but elegant, the deep blue wool falling in graceful lines with small covered buttons she'd saved from her mother's sewing box. She'd added no frills or unnecessary ornament. Like everything else in her life, it was exactly what it needed to be and nothing more. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Helen Morrison stood there practically vibrating with excitement.
Miss Caroline, I came to help with the book table setup, but Mother doesn't know I'm here. She's still furious about the Literary Society accepting you.
The girl's eyes widened as she spotted the blue dress.
Oh, that's beautiful. Are you wearing it tonight?
I thought I might, Caroline said carefully.
Helen clapped her hands.
Mr. Boone won't be able to take his eyes off you. Everyone knows he's coming tonight specifically to see you.
Everyone knows no such thing,
Caroline protested, but her cheeks warmed. Oh, they do. Timothy Patterson told the Murphy boys, who told their sister, who told me. Mr. Boone never attends dances. Never. But he asked Mr. Patterson for the evening off special. As they walked to the town hall, carrying boxes of books for the Literary Society table, Caroline noticed the extra activity. Bunting hung from buildings and the smell of baking drifted from various kitchens. The spring dance was Ash Hollow's attempt at civilization, a chance to pretend they were somewhere more refined than a frontier town clinging to existence. Elizabeth Crawford met them at the hall, her arms full of tablecloths. Perfect timing, Caroline. Would you arrange the books? You have such an eye for display. They worked through the morning, transforming the usually stark hall into something festive. Other members of the Literary Society arrived to help, and Caroline found herself at the center of easy conversation and shared purpose. It still amazed her how quickly she'd gone from pariah to participant in this small circle. "I heard Silas Boone will be attending," Mrs. Wells mentioned casually while arranging donation boxes. "First time in the 5 years he's been here." "People change," Elizabeth said with a meaningful look at Caroline. "Sometimes for the better." That evening, Caroline dressed with trembling fingers. The blue dress fit perfectly, the color bringing out the green in her eyes just as she'd hoped. She pinned her hair up in a style that was both proper and flattering, allowing a few tendrils to escape around her face. Looking in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. Not because she looked so different, but because the woman staring back seemed hopeful, open, ready. The walk to the town hall felt both endless and too short. She could hear the music from a block away, fiddle and piano mixing with laughter and conversation. Her steps slowed as doubt crept in. What was she doing? She'd built her life on independence, on needing no one. Was she ready to risk that for possibility? But then she thought of Silas, patient, respectful, seeing her for exactly who she was. She thought of his hand in hers during those fever-dark nights, of the way he'd removed his hat when he spoke his truths. She thought of choosing rather than being chosen. She entered through the side door, wanting to check on the book table before making her presence known. The hall was transformed by lamplight and decoration full of townspeople in their finest clothes. She spotted Mrs. Morrison holding court near the punch bowl, Mayor Morrison glad-handing voters, young couples attempting complicated dance steps. And there, standing alone by the window, was Silas Boone. He'd dressed for the occasion in a black suit she'd never seen before. His dark hair neatly combed, boots polished to a shine. But what stopped her heart was the way he stood slightly apart from the crowd, patient and watchful, clearly waiting for something. For someone. For her. As if sensing her presence, he turned. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and the noise and movement around them seemed to fade. He didn't smile. This moment was too weighted for that. Instead, he simply started walking toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. They met in the middle of the dance floor, obvious to anyone watching. Caroline was aware of heads turning, conversations stopping, but she couldn't look away from Silas's face. "Caroline," he said softly, and her name on his lips was better than any music. "You came," she said unnecessarily. "I said I would." He took in her appearance with one long look that made her cheeks warm. "You're beautiful, but then you always are." "Silas, dance with me." It wasn't a question, but wasn't quite a command either. It was simply what came next, as natural as breathing. The fiddler struck up a waltz, and Caroline placed her hand in his. His other hand settled at her waist, proper and respectful, but firm. They began to move, and she discovered he danced like he did everything else, with quiet competence and surprising grace. "Where did a cowboy learn to waltz?" she asked as he guided her through a turn. "Told you, the Army. Sergeant Johnson was particular about his men being civilized." His thumb brushed against her palm, the lightest touch that somehow set her nerves singing. "Haven't had much cause to use it since." "But you remembered." "For you, I'd remember anything." They danced in silence for a moment, aware of the eyes on them, the whispers starting. Caroline saw Mrs. Morrison's face pinched with disapproval, but also Helen's delighted smile, Elizabeth Crawford's approving nod, Martha Olson's satisfied grin. "They're all watching," Caroline murmured. "Let them." Silas drew her slightly closer, still proper, but definitely making a statement. "I'm not ashamed to be seen with you. Are you ashamed to be seen with me?" "No." The word came out fiercer than intended. "Never." "Good." The dance ended, but he didn't release her immediately. "Walk with me," he asked. "It's warm in here." She nodded, and they made their way to the door. Caroline pausing to check the book table where Helen was cheerfully taking donations. The girl gave her a theatrical wink that made Caroline shake her head. Outside, the spring evening was cool and clear. Stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They walked slowly, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I've been thinking," Silas said eventually, "about what you said. The difference between independence and isolation.
And I think maybe I've been guilty of the same thing, keeping myself apart because it was safer than risking connection. He stopped walking, turned to face her. But safe isn't the same as living. No, Caroline agreed softly. It's not. Caroline May Latimer, he said formally, taking his hat off despite being outdoors. I want to court you, properly, with all the respect and patience you deserve. I want to walk you home from church and bring you flowers and sit on your porch talking about books and dreams and whatever else you'll share with me. Caroline's heart was beating so fast she was sure he could hear it. And if I say yes, what happens to my independence, my shop, my life? Nothing, everything. He stepped closer. Your independence isn't something I want to take, Caroline. It's something I admire. I don't want to cage you. I want to fly beside you if you'll have me. She looked up at him, this man who understood her in ways she was only beginning to understand herself, who saw her strength as something to celebrate, not conquer, who offered partnership, not possession. Yes, she said simply. His smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and inevitable. Yes. Yes to courting. Yes to walking home from church. Yes to talks on the porch. She reached up, touched his cheek. Yes to possibility. He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. I'll court you until you're sure, he promised. Until you know beyond doubt that choosing me doesn't mean losing yourself. And my vow, she asked, needing him to understand. The promise I made is yours to keep or break as you see fit, he said firmly. I'll never ask for what you're not ready to give, Caroline. Your first night last night, every night, they're yours until you decide otherwise. Music drifted from the hall, another waltz beginning. Through the windows, she could see couples dancing the literary society table, doing brisk business life, moving forward in its endless dance of connection and community. We should go back, she said. People will talk if we stay out here too long. Let them talk, but he offered his arm properly. Though I would like another dance if you're willing. They returned to the hall together, entering side by side this time. The looks were different now, some calculating, some approving, some envious. But Caroline found she didn't care. She'd spent so long worrying about what others thought, letting their judgments shape her choices. No more. She was Caroline May Latimer, independent businesswoman, literary society member, and now by her own choice woman being courted by Silas Boone. All of these identities existed together, each making the others richer. As Silas led her onto the dance floor for another waltz, she caught sight of their reflection in the window. They looked right together, him tall and solid, her bright and determined, both moving in perfect synchronization. What are you thinking? He asked as they turned. That maybe the bravest thing isn't standing alone, she said. Maybe it's choosing to stand with someone who sees you truly. And do you feel seen, Caroline May? She met his eyes, those steady gray depths that had watched her with such patience and respect from the very beginning. Yes, she said, for the first time in my life completely seen. The music swelled around them and they danced on, while Ash Hollow watched and whispered and wondered. But on the dance floor, in each other's arms, Caroline and Silas existed in their own world, one built on mutual respect, careful trust, and the radical act of choosing love on their own terms. As the evening drew to a close and they walked back to her shop, Caroline felt the weight of her old vow transform. It was still there, still hers, but it no longer felt like armor against the world. Instead, it felt like a gift she could choose to give when and how she decided. And someday, not tonight, not tomorrow, but someday when she was ready, she would make that choice freely, joyfully, with full knowledge that giving herself to Silas Boone meant not losing her independence, but multiplying it through the power of true partnership. But tonight, as he kissed her hand at her door and promised to call tomorrow, it was enough to have taken the first step, to have chosen possibility over protection, connection over isolation, love over fear. The girl who'd fled Texas would hardly recognize the woman who now stood watching Silas walk away his promise to return tomorrow, warming her more than any fire. But Caroline recognized herself, independent, strong, free, and finally ready to see what that freedom could become when shared with someone worthy of the gift. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what you thought about Caroline and Silas's journey. If you enjoyed this Wild West romance, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit that like button. And don't forget to press the hype button to help more people discover this story. Your support means everything.